Eastern Kentucky's gas isn't a secret either. People already know Big Sandy, the giant gas field that's been running since the 1920s. What almost nobody knows is that 2 miles straight down, underneath all of it, sits a completely different basin, one that's more than 500 million years older, and nobody has ever fully figured out what's actually down there. There's a stretch of hollow road in Floyd County, Kentucky, lined with small pump jacks and gas wellheads tucked into hillsides, quiet metal boxes half hidden by brush that have been sitting there since grandparents were young. Locals drive past them the way you'd drive past a mailbox without a second thought, because gas from these hills has just always been part of the landscape. Development of the Big Sandy field began in western Floyd County back in the 1920s and spread concentrically outward through the surrounding hollows for the next 50 years, slowing to infill and marginal drilling only after 1970. Big Sandy grew into the largest gas field in the entire Appalachian Basin, eventually covering most of Letcher, Knott, Floyd, Martin, and Pike counties in Kentucky and reaching across the state line into West Virginia, all of it drawing gas out of Devonian shale laid down roughly 350 million years ago in a shallow sea that once covered the eastern half of the continent. More than 10,500 wells have been drilled into that shale across a 25-county stretch of eastern Kentucky, and cumulative production from the state's Devonian shale alone is estimated at more than 84 billion cubic meters of gas, with researchers believing the rock still holds tens of trillions of cubic meters more in place, most of it never economically recoverable at today's prices and technology. That's the well-known story, the one that's been true and largely unchanged for a century. It's also only the top layer of what's actually down there. 2 miles beneath those same hollows sits something else entirely, a deep, narrow rift basin geologists call the Rome Trough, named for rocks that are Cambrian in age, more than 500 million years old, laid down long before anything with a backbone existed anywhere on Earth. The trough runs as a northeast trending structure across eastern Kentucky and into West Virginia, and where it's deepest it holds up to 10,000 feet of sediment, older rock like the Rome Formation and the Conasauga Group and the Mount Simon Sandstone, that simply doesn't exist at all on the stable shelf just a few miles to the north across a series of ancient extensional faults. In parts of the wider trough system further north, the crystalline basement rock sits buried under as much as 20,000 feet of stacked Paleozoic layers, deep enough that almost no well has ever reached it, and almost no modern seismic survey has properly imaged it. Companies have been drilling toward that deep section on and off since the late 1940s, mostly with discouraging results scattered across 70 years of sporadic effort. For most of that time, the Rome Trough had a reputation in the industry as a place that occasionally showed a flicker of promise and consistently failed to turn it into anything a company could build a real business around. That reputation cracked, just slightly, in the middle of 1994. A company called Carson Associates drilled a well in Elliott County named the Kazi, testing a zone in the Upper Conasauga Group and Rome Formation at just over 6,200 feet, a depth well within reach of ordinary drilling rigs, but rock nobody had managed to produce commercially before. The well blew out during completion and initially flowed roughly 11 million cubic feet of gas a day, a genuinely strong commercial rate from a formation the industry had mostly written off decades earlier as a curiosity rather than a real target. Some formation damage occurred after crews got the well under control, and it settled down to producing around 500,000 cubic feet a day by the following year, respectable but far short of the initial blowout numbers. Even so, geologists at the Kentucky Geological Survey called the Kazi well confirmation that a deep Cambrian gas play in the Rome Trough could actually work commercially, not just show gas on a mudlog, and the discovery kicked off a fresh round of exploration almost immediately, with at least 3 other companies drilling deep tests into the same trend within the following year, including a second well in Elliott County by a company called Blue Ridge Group. It wasn't the kind of clean, one-time discovery story most gas fields get to tell. It was messier than that. A well that blew out on the way to proving its point, and still managed to prove it anyway. Carson Associates went on to permit an offset well nearby, drilled deeper to 7,500 feet into the same Rome Formation, while other operators quietly assembled acreage of their own across the trend, betting that the Kazi well's flow rate wasn't a fluke. More than a decade later, in 2007, a separate drilling program started up in Boyd, Carter, and Lawrence counties, in ground west of Big Sandy that had barely been touched, built around new pipeline capacity and aimed specifically at reaching the same Cambrian Rome sands that had produced gas to the southeast in Elliott County. The next real step came almost 20 years later, when researchers at the Kentucky Geological Survey, working through a regional study called the Rome Trough Consortium, identified the Cambrian Age Rogersville shale, buried inside that same Conasauga Group, as a genuinely organic rich source rock back in 2002 that the kind that actually generates oil and gas on its own rather than simply holding whatever migrated in from somewhere else. A discovery well drilled into the Rogersville in Lawrence County in 2013 confirmed the formation was really there, and that it matched the geochemistry researchers had predicted on paper more than a decade earlier. What followed wasn't a rush, though. Only about 5 additional wells were drilled into the Rogersville over the next several years, and the economic case for producing it at any meaningful scale still hadn't been proven by any of them. One of those wells, drilled by Chesapeake Energy into the Northup Law Lease in Lawrence County, set a brand new Kentucky state drilling depth record in the process, testing both the Rogersville Shale and the Rome Formation sitting beneath it, and taking 67 days to reach total depth compared with the 104 days an earlier record-setting well needed to drill back in 1977, a striking gap that says a lot about how far drilling technology had advanced in the 4 decades between the two projects. That earlier record, 15,200 feet deep in Webster County out in the Illinois basin side of the state, had stood for nearly 4 decades before Chesapeake's well finally broke it. The Northup Law well reached total depth, but according to state filings it reported no clear hydrocarbon shows and no production, testing rock that still hadn't given up a straightforward answer about whether it could ever be produced profitably at that depth. None of this uncertainty is really about the geology being weak. It's about the trough itself being genuinely strange, formed roughly 500 million years ago when an early episode of continental rifting pulled the crust apart along a northeast trending line, dropping a long, narrow strip of ground down relative to the stable shelf sitting undisturbed just to the north. As that rift basin subsided over millions of years, it filled with thousands of feet of sediment that the shelf to the north never received at all, since it was never dropped down far enough to catch it, burying source rocks and reservoir rocks together far deeper than anything the shallow Devonian shale above it ever experienced in its own much shorter geologic history. That extra depth is exactly what makes the Rome Trough both promising and stubborn at the same time. The same deep burial that generated real hydrocarbons down there in the first place also makes every well brutally expensive to drill, every test slow and costly to interpret properly, and every single result difficult to generalize confidently to the next well only a few miles away along the same trend. None of that shows up if you're standing beside a decades-old pump jack in a Floyd County hollow, watching gas that's been flowing since your grandparents' generation without any drama at all. But researchers are still actively working the deeper question today. The Kentucky Geological Survey's Rome Trough studies, going back to the early 1990s and continuing through the Conasauga Shale Research Consortium, funded in part by the U.S. Department of Energy, have cataloged as many as 16 distinct oil and gas plays stacked at different depths within the trough. And industry geologists describe the Conasauga Rome system as one of the more geologically interesting deep targets left anywhere in the entire Appalachian Basin. Companies including Abarta Energy have continued evaluating acreage across the trend in more recent years, even as the shallower Marcellus and Utica shales next door have absorbed the overwhelming majority of the region's drilling investment and available pipeline capacity, including the 2 billion cubic foot a day Mountain Valley Pipeline that finally came online in 2024 after more than a decade of regulatory delay. The Rome Trough, by comparison, still has no dedicated pipeline infrastructure built specifically around it, and no company yet willing to stake a large development program on rock that keeps producing genuinely mixed results well by well, decade after decade, in a pattern that hasn't fundamentally changed since Carson Associates drilled the Kazi back in 1994. The wells drilled into Big Sandy in the 1920s weren't wrong about where the gas was. They found an enormous field, one of the largest in the entire Appalachian Basin, and it's still quietly producing today, a full century later, exactly where the original crews left it. The Rome Trough tells a different, more honest kind of story, one where a genuine discovery in 1994 and a genuine source rock, identified in 2002, still haven't added up to a clear commercial verdict, even after a new state depth record got broken chasing the answer a few years ago. Some ground gets written off early, and later proven wrong once someone comes back with better tools. Other ground, like this one, just stays genuinely open, 100 million years deeper than anything anyone's fully figured out yet, with the drill bit still the only honest way to find out for certain what's actually down there. That question is still unresolved, which is exactly the kind of story worth following. Subscribe for more.